In Matthew 18, we find a parable unique to the Gospel of Matthew. It is not found in Mark, Luke, or John. And this parable extends Jesus' teaching on forgiveness to his disciples and to Peter in particular. Earlier in the chapter, Jesus gives his teaching on forgiveness in community. If someone sins against you, you go to them and try and work it out. If they won't work it out, you go to them with a friend. If they still won't work it out, you go to the church with the situation. If they still won't work it out and ask for forgiveness, then you, quote, let him be to you as the Gentile or tax collector. In other words, for Jesus, forgiveness is not unconditional. For a community to function well, people need to be able to say that they are wrong and ask for forgiveness. And then people need to receive that humility and extend forgiveness. Peter hears this teaching and he approaches Jesus with a considered question. Lord, how many times will my brother sin against me and I shall forgive him? As many as 7 times? Peter thought he was being generous with this number. Jesus stretches him further. I tell you, not as many as 7 times, but as many as 70 times 7. Then Jesus launches into his parable. Thus, the kingdom of the heavens has been likened to a man who was a king, who wished to reckon up accounts with his slaves, and as he began his reckoning, one who was indebted to him for 10,000 talents was brought forward. And as he was unable to make repayment, the master commanded he be sold, as well as his wife and children, and all such things as he owns, and repayment to be made. Then the slave fell down and made obeisance to him, saying, Be patient with me, and I shall repay you everything. And that slave's master, being inwardly moved with compassion, released him and forgave him his loan. But going out, that slave found one of his fellow slaves who owed him 100 denarii and seized hold of and throttled him, saying, Pay me everything you owe. Then his fellow slave fell down and implored him, saying, Be patient toward me, and I shall repay you. He would not, though, but went off and threw him into prison until he should repay the debt. Therefore, seeing the things that had taken place, his fellow slaves were extremely upset and went and explained to their master all the things that had happened. Then, calling him forward, his master says to him, You wicked slave, I forgave you all that debt after you implored me. Should you not also have mercy on your fellow slave, even as I had mercy on you? And in anger, his master delivered him to the inquisitors until he should repay everything owing to him. The parable itself is about the grace that God extends to us, and therefore the need that we have to also be gracious with others. If God has forgiven us, then we should forgive others. This is only highlighted by the scale of the amounts forgiven. The king forgave the slave 10,000 talents. A talent was roughly worth a year's salary. To put that into perspective, in 2019, in the United States, the average American worker made $36,000. If we take 36,000 as the modern equivalent of the ancient talent, then 10,000 talents would be $360 million, a third of $1 billion. That's an astounding amount of money for someone to take on, much less be forgiven. That same slave was owed 100 denarii by another slave. A denarius was roughly equal to a day's wage. Using the same modern scale that we used previously, 100 denarii is worth about $13,000. Again, a significant amount, but nowhere near the amount that he had previously been forgiven. And of course, that is the point. Even if someone has hurt us significantly, if they come to us seeking forgiveness, we are to remember all that God had forgiven us, and we are to do as God does and extend forgiveness to the other. For our purposes in this study, though, we need to look at slavery as it is found in this parable. We have a slave master who is also a king. It is not uncommon in a parable for the character who represents God to be described as a king. We also know that kings and rulers in the ancient world would have had a lot of slaves. The slave had borrowed or had been entrusted to an incredible sum of money from his master king. We've seen enslaved peoples have access to significant sums of money in the ancient world, especially in Ephesus. But 10,000 talents, $360 million? That is not a reflection of the historic situation of ancient enslaved peoples. What we have here is the parable's surprise, the twist. People listening to the parable would have been struck by the amount that the slave had owed his master, and therefore the amount that he was forgiven. Interestingly, the slave was owed money by another slave. We know that slaves could buy and own other slaves, so perhaps the fact that one slave could loan or borrow from another slave shouldn't be too hard to swallow. One element of this parable that challenges what we know of ancient slavery is the fact that the unforgiving slave sent the other slave to prison. This would have only been possible if the unforgiving slave owned the other slave. And as we can see from the parable, this is not the case. The slave could not have been thrown in prison unless the master of that slave allowed it to happen. The slave was the property of the master, and as far as the master would be concerned, his slave's debt to another slave would have been utterly meaningless. So this is a bit of a mystery. While the two slaves and the slave master king are central to the parable, their actual identity as slave and master is less so. The parable could just as easily have featured 3 free people as it does a master and 2 slaves. It could have been 3 shepherds. It could have been a king and 2 subjects. It could have been 3 random friends. But remember, slavery was such a part of life and culture that it was totally normal to feature slavery in a parable story, even if the slavery itself was not integral to its meaning.